Hello, my name is C Bruno, and today I'm going to be covering some basics of arpeggios. These are basically just some of the building blocks of chords and of solos, so I decided it was a good idea to cover them. I was actually asked to be an assistant for a Warnick-style jam class, which was really very eye-opening for me in terms of just some of the beginner stuff that maybe I've just forgotten or just haven't really dealt with in a little while. I figured this would be a really good lesson. So arpeggios are essentially just the basics of the chords. So meaning you're essentially playing the three tones in the major scale that make up a major chord. So for G, for example, that would be G, B, and D, and that's for the major side. Arpeggios come in all shapes and sizes. You're going to have major arpeggios, minors, dominant, diminished, etc. Today we're only focusing on the major ones, so all these rules still apply, same ideas, but just to more complex chords. And also, please forgive the sparsity of my new house or my new studio that hasn't finished being built. So forgive me there. Anyway. So basically, the arpeggio is, like I said, the first or the three notes, the 1, 3, and 5 in the major key for a major chord, and that basically just boils down for when you're playing a G chord. You can actually see those notes that you're playing, depending on the G chord that you're playing. Right? This is probably the most obvious one here, where you can see you have those notes involved. I'm going to move this slightly this direction. There we go. So you have those just main notes involved, and if you look at those individual notes, you can kind of map them out to the chord, as I'm going to show on the screen that direction. But you have your open double stops if you want to look at it that way, 2 on the bottom here. You have another double stop here if you want to look at it that way. And so those are all, again, just another way to look at these arpeggios. And so one of the best things that you can do for these is just kind of learn how they interact with any song. So arpeggios, for example, there's like 3 levels I think that you could use these in from a beginner solo standpoint. So I'll cover each 3 of those, and I'll try and do it as condensed as possible. So the first way essentially would be just using the major key, whatever that is, that arpeggio over the entire structure. And so that means no matter what chord is playing, you're playing in the key of G, for example, a G note, a B note, or a D note. Now that's not going to be the most interesting of solos, and there could be some flubs here and there, but in a 1-4-5 song in the key of G in this example, you'll notice that there's always a chord tone somewhere, right? And so when you're playing a G chord, what that means is that as the backup, the rhythm is playing the G. If you're playing a G arpeggio, well, all those notes are chord tones, right? Chord tones always sound good played over that chord, so they'll always sound decent. But when you move to the C chord, right, you notice that obviously you have a couple notes, C and E, that are not in those G chords, but you do have one. You have the G note. So C, E, and G, you can play the G, and that'll be an arpeggio of the G. Similar with D, D is spelled D, F sharp, and A, and so then you have the D note in there as well. And so that means that there's always an arpeggio note somewhere in one of those chords. And so if you focus on playing, for example, just the G, B, and D within that type of song, it's going to sound okay, right? And you have some other similarities here too. Like, for example, the E is the relative minor of G, and it performs a very similar function. So that's going to sound pretty good as well over those chords. A is the second, so it'll sound a little weird maybe over the G, but it will still sound okay for the most part too. So you can play basically these notes, just those, over just a G song. All right, so "Roll Into My Sweet Baby's Arms" is a good song to use for this. So we're going to play that in the key of G. We'll do this at about 110 beats per minute, just to kind of start off with. And I'm only going to be playing the G arpeggio notes, okay?
1, 2, 3, 4.
right, so there in that you heard basically we just kind of went through just the G, B, and D notes, and they sounded all good. That's the point of this type of practice. They're going to sound good. The first part of there, you heard that I was just kind of playing slower kind of notes through, and that sounds okay too, just kind of going up the scale. But it sounds a little bit better when you shake it up with a little bit of spice on the time side. So when you start playing around with like a little bit faster notes here, quarter notes, eighth notes, and things like that, it'll sound more interesting, right? So anyway, that's level 1 of using arpeggios. Level 2 goes a little step further. And in this case, you'd start using the arpeggios of each individual chord being played. So again, in a 1-4-5 song in the key of G, those chords would be G, C, and D, right? And so you'd play the 1-4-5 of those. So that will be a little bit more interesting because now you're starting to lead the listener to the next chord, so you're playing with the progression itself. You're not necessarily playing to the melody yet, but you're playing to the progression. So the difference in that is that you can start hearing the changes between those chords, and then you can start leading the listener down that path. A lot of melodies will do this naturally. Through the melody, they'll start playing more chord tones for the chord that you're playing, just as part of it. So this is a good step in that direction. So again, we're going to go back over Rollin' in My Sweet Baby's Arms, again in G. But this time, instead of playing just the G arpeggio, we're going to go through the different arpeggios for G, C, and D, respectively, when they come up.
1, 2, 3, 4.
See, that was a little bit more interesting, and you can hear the chords kind of moving through that solo riff. So that's a good way to keep the listener engaged and make it a little bit more complex. So that's the second level of really using these arpeggios, is to play to each individual chord throughout the progression. Now this would work if the progression was a larger progression, for example, like Old Home Place that has 4 chords in it. You just add that arpeggio in as well. So that's another example of how you can use these. The third, or the last example I'm going to give here, is then starting to use that information. So now you have these arpeggios as your skeleton, right? So you have the skeletons of each individual chord as you're playing through them. Now you're going to start adding the tweener notes, the notes that aren't in the arpeggio. Now, these could be scale tones. So if you're familiar with the pentatonic scale, you can use those. These could be non-scale tones as well. They could be just kind of out there weird notes. You'll kind of use that to determine. The easiest way to start with this is to take these arpeggios and then move up to using pentatonic scales, because that only adds 2 extra notes to it, and it still will sound good over the whole cycle. I have a whole lesson that talks about that as well, so I encourage you to check that out. I believe it's under more of the double stop stuff. But once again, we're going to go back through Rollin' in My Sweet Baby's Arms. Once again, I'm just going to play the arpeggio notes, but this time I'm going to add a couple extra notes here or there. Not anything crazy, but just a couple notes that are outside of these notes.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Just slightly more interesting, some flubs here and there, but the idea behind that is just to kind of break out of some of the familiarity with that and use different chord tones throughout that. Some of those were going to be pentatonic notes, some of those are not, and that's okay. So I hope this kind of helps break down a little bit of what the arpeggios can do and like how they're beneficial and how you can use them in your everyday playing. I've included a few exercises within this lesson as well that go over ways that you can practice the arpeggios going in one measure or two measures, doing 1-4-5 or 1-4-1-5-1 progressions, all in the key of G. What I would encourage you to do as a practice is to take these and move them into different keys. Do the same thing in the key of A, C, D, etc., and get more familiar with them. There's other practices out there too, aside from the one that I provided here, like the Tim O'Brien practice that basically takes the arpeggios and plays them in the cycle of fourths. That's a really interesting warm-up as well. And I recall him at one point saying that he likes to play it that way because then it puts all the tones that he would need under his fingers. He knows where they are in the progression, things like that. I'm not 100% sure if that was him that said it. I think it was. Either way, it's good sound advice. So I would suggest going through this in as many different keys as you feel comfortable. Ultimately, you want to do it in all keys, but you can start off, especially as a beginner, don't fret about every single key. Start going through the popular ones that you hear at jams, the most common, right? And that's going to end up being most likely G, C, D, and A. Those are going to be the most common keys that you hear at any jam. And then you can start expanding those things into like E, B, B flat, F, things like that, as you get better and you start progressing. Remember, mandolin is a very easy instrument to transpose on once you start getting some of those basics. And so when you go through the exercise, try and do them as a lot of them as a closed position exercise as much as you can, because that'll help speed up that process of being able to move them through. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on my website at mattcbruno.com. And I hope you have a great day. Happy picking.